The sun was a hammer over the plains of western Kansas. It beat down on the bleached grass until the land itself seemed to sigh, sending up shimmering waves of heat that blurred the horizon. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything: the thirsty leaves of the lone cottonwood by the creek, the weathered planks of the ranch house, and the inside of a man's throat. Horses stood with heads hung low in the meager shade of the corral, their flanks heaving, their tails flicking uselessly at the cloud of buzzing flies that was the season's only constant companion. This was Granger land, and it was an unforgiving kingdom. Eli Granger, at 36, felt as weathered as the landscape he called home. His face was a map of long days and hard seasons, etched with lines around his eyes from squinting into that relentless sun. His hands, thick and calloused, knew the language of rope, leather, and splintered wood better than they knew the touch of another person. It had been 2 years since Martha was taken by the fever, and the silence she left behind was a physical presence in the sprawling, empty house. It sat in her rocking chair on the porch, lay beside him in the cold bed, and echoed in the space where her laughter used to be. His only steady companions now were Jeb, an aging blue-tick hound with mournful eyes, and the 2 hands he employed, a grizzled old-timer named Silas and a boy of 17 called Luke, neither of whom were much for conversation beyond talk of cattle and weather. Loneliness was a slow grind, wearing a man down to his essentials, and Eli had come to understand that his essential need was for something more than survival. He needed a life. That was why he'd done it, why he'd swallowed his pride and written to a service back east, a discreet advertisement for a wife, a mail-order bride. It felt like a transaction, a purchase of companionship, and it chafed at his soul. But the nights were too long, and the silence was too loud. After a few stilted, formal letters were exchanged, a woman named Clara Mae Jennings from Boston had agreed. Her letters were brief, her penmanship neat and contained, revealing almost nothing of the woman behind the words. She wrote that she was of good health, could cook and keep a house, and sought the clean air of the West for a new start. It was enough. The day she was due to arrive, Eli found himself pacing the porch, an unfamiliar knot of anxiety tightening in his gut. He had washed, shaved so close his skin was raw, and put on the same stiff suit he'd worn to Martha's funeral. When the stagecoach finally appeared, a lumbering beast kicking up a plume of ochre dust, his heart hammered against his ribs. It slowed to a halt, the driver shouting at the weary horses. The door swung open. The woman who stepped down was not what he had expected. He had no clear picture in his mind, but it wasn't this. She was small, so thin it seemed the prairie wind might carry her off. Her traveling dress, a deep blue, was well made but faded, and a simple bonnet shadowed a face that was pale and drawn. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes, large and the color of a stormy sky, held a weariness that belonged to someone much older. They were eyes that didn't meet his, but rather darted around, taking in the vast, empty space as if searching for a threat. When she finally looked at him, it was a fleeting, guarded glance before her gaze dropped to the dusty ground between them. "Mr. Granger?" Her voice was soft, barely a whisper against the wind. It carried the clipped, clean accent of the East, a sound as foreign here as a songbird in a dust storm. "Ma'am," Eli managed, stepping forward and taking her small, worn carpet bag. "Welcome." He led her to the house, the silence between them thick and awkward. She moved with a strange, quiet caution, as if she were afraid the floorboards might cry out at her presence. In the days that followed, that caution never left her. They settled into a routine that was both intimate and achingly distant. They were husband and wife in name, sharing a roof, but they lived as polite, wary strangers. He had made it clear on her first night, gesturing to the spare room he had prepared for her. "Your room," he'd said gruffly, trying to put her at ease. "Take your time to settle. I won't press you." A flicker of something, relief, maybe, had crossed her face before it was gone. Clara was a phantom in his home. She was a tireless worker, rising before the sun to start the stove, keeping the house cleaner than it had been in years, and producing simple, hearty meals that she placed on the table with quiet efficiency. But she spoke only when spoken to, and her answers were always brief and simple, never inviting further conversation. She never mentioned Boston, or her family, or any life she might have had before stepping off that stagecoach. She was a woman without a past. Eli watched her, perplexed. He saw the way she'd flinch if he moved too quickly, the way her hands would often tremble as she cleared the dishes. And at night, he would sometimes hear it, a muffled cry from her room, a gasp of fear cut short. He'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his heart aching with a confusing mix of pity and frustration. Who was this woman he had bound himself to? What shadows had followed her across the country to his doorstep? The old barn became an unexpected focal point of the tension between them. It was the original structure on the property, built by his grandfather, and it was showing its age. The roof sagged, the wood was weathered to a silver gray, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the walls. Eli used it for storing old tools and tack, but his plan was to tear it down before winter and expand the granary. It was a practical decision, a necessary improvement for the ranch. One afternoon, he asked Clara to fetch a spare bucket from inside. He watched from the doorway as she stepped into the dim, dusty interior. The air was thick with the smell of old hay, dry rot, and forgotten years. She took a few hesitant steps, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Suddenly, her foot came down on a loose floorboard near the back wall. It gave a loud, groaning creak. The effect on her was immediate and terrifying. A choked gasp escaped her lips. Every ounce of color drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, stark white. Her eyes, wide with a horror that made no sense, were fixed on the floor. She stumbled back, one hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream, her breath coming in ragged, shallow pants. "Clara?" Eli said, moving toward her. "It's just an old board." She didn't seem to hear him. She scrambled backward out of the barn, her gaze still locked on that spot, and didn't stop until her back hit the solid wood of the main house. She stood there, trembling like a leaf, her chest rising and falling violently. Eli stared, dumbfounded. It was more than a simple fright. It was a profound, soul-deep terror. He had seen men thrown from a horse with less fear in their eyes. Later that evening, at the dinner table, he brought up his plans. "I'm thinking of starting on that old barn next week," he said, trying to sound casual. "Need the space for the granary before the first snow." Clara, who had been pushing a piece of potato around her plate, went utterly still. Her fork clattered against the ceramic. She looked up at him, and for the first time, her eyes held his with a desperate, pleading intensity. "No," she whispered. "Please, you shouldn't." "It's falling apart. Clara, it's no use to anyone." It's a historic part of the property, isn't it?" she stammered, searching for a reason. "It's better to leave some things as they are, to not disturb them." The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Eli looked at her, at the raw fear in her gaze, and felt a wave of confusion. It was just a barn, an old, rotten building. But to her it was something more, a monster, a tomb. He didn't understand, but he saw the sincerity of her plea, against his better judgment, against all practicality. He heard himself say, "All right, we'll leave it for now." The relief that washed over her was so palpable, it felt like a third presence in the room. The tension left her shoulders, and she gave him a small, trembling nod of gratitude before dropping her gaze back to her plate. But the barn had been disturbed, and so had she. Her nightmares grew worse. She became even more withdrawn, her silence heavier. 2 days later, Eli came in from the fields to find the house quiet. It wasn't unusual, but a prickle of unease ran down his spine. He called her name. No answer. He checked her room, the kitchen, the porch. Nothing. A cold dread began to seep into him. He strode outside, his eyes scanning the property. He found her by the creek, half hidden in the tall grass. She was on her knees, doubled over, her body racked with violent spasms. "Clara!" He ran to her side, dropping to his knees in the dirt. Her face was ashen, beaded with sweat, her lips pressed into a thin white line of pain. "My stomach!" she gasped, her hands clutching her abdomen. "It hurts." Even as she spoke, her eyes rolled back in her head, and her body went limp. She fainted, slumping against him. For a moment, Eli froze, the sheer fragility of her shocking him. She weighed next to nothing. He gathered her into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, and carried her back to the house with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. He laid her gently on her bed, her small frame looking lost in the middle of the large mattress. He didn't know what to do. The nearest doctor was a day's ride away. He fetched a cloth and a basin of cool water from the well, his movements clumsy and uncertain. He sat on the edge of the bed and began to bathe her forehead. Her skin was clammy. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. He sat with her for what felt like hours as the afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting stripes of gold across the room. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, the slight flutter of her eyelids. He saw the faint, silvery scars on her wrists, almost invisible unless the light caught them just so. He saw the permanent shadows under her eyes. This woman was a vessel of pain, and he had invited her into his home, knowing nothing. As dusk began to settle, her eyes slowly opened. They were hazy at first, unfocused, before they landed on his face. Fear flashed in them, raw and instinctual, and she tried to pull away. "Easy now," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You fainted. You've been unwell." She relaxed slightly, but her body remained tense. The room was growing dark, and the silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Without thinking, moved by an impulse he didn't understand, Eli reached out and took her hand. It was small and cold, and it trembled in his. He simply held it, his large, rough hand completely enveloping hers. He expected her to pull away, to recoil from his touch. She didn't. Her fingers curled weakly around one of his. She turned her head on the pillow, her storm-gray eyes meeting his in the dim light. The fear was still there, but beneath it, for the first time, was something else, a flicker of trust, a silent acknowledgement of his presence, of this small, simple comfort. In that quiet room, with the vast, lonely prairie darkening outside, they held hands. No words were spoken. None were needed. It was the first true touch that had passed between them, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of secrets and sorrow. And in the profound silence, Eli felt the first, faint stirring of a connection that felt deeper and far more dangerous than simple sympathy. That single moment of connection, of a hand held in the twilight, was not a cure, but it was a beginning. The rigid formality that had defined their existence began to soften at the edges. A fragile trust, like the first green shoot after a long winter, started to push its way through the hard-packed soil of their arrangement. Life on the Granger Ranch found a new, quieter rhythm. Clara's domain was the house. She moved through it with a newfound purpose, no longer a phantom but a quiet presence. The scent of baking bread began to replace the stale air of loneliness. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, coaxing from it stews that warmed a man's bones and coffee that was strong enough to face the dawn. Eli's domain remained the land. He mended fences, tended to the cattle, and worked under the vast, indifferent sky. But he found his thoughts drifting back to the house more often. He would watch from the corral as her silhouette passed by the kitchen window, and a strange, protective warmth would spread through his chest. Their evenings changed the most. The silence was no longer a wall between them, but a space they could share. They would sit at the small kitchen table after supper, the lantern casting a warm, golden glow. He would tell her about his day, a stubborn calf, a patch of fence that needed mending, and she would listen, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. In return, she began to speak, her words careful and measured, like someone testing the ice on a frozen pond. One evening, emboldened by the whiskey he'd poured to soothe the ache in his back, Eli asked, "What was Boston like? I've never been further east than Missouri." She looked up, her expression guarded. For a moment, he thought she would retreat into her usual silence, but then she spoke, her voice soft, crowded and loud, full of noise and stone. Not like this." She gestured vaguely towards the window, beyond which lay an endless sea of grass and stars. "You miss it?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "No, I don't miss it." Another night, she offered a piece of her past, a carefully selected, worn smooth stone from the wreckage of her life. "My mother passed when I was very young," she said, her gaze distant. I lived in an orphanage for a time, St. Jude's Home for Girls." She spoke the name as if it were a foreign country she had visited long ago. "They taught us to sew and to be quiet." Eli absorbed this information, recognizing it for what it was, a test, a small offering of trust. He noticed she never mentioned a father. The man was a void in her stories, a silence more profound than any she had ever kept with him. He did not press. He simply nodded, storing the fact away. Another piece of the puzzle that was Clara. But as a tentative comfort grew between them in the light of day, the darkness brought its own truths. Eli began to notice a pattern. As the sun would dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, a shadow would fall over Clara's spirit. The light would leave her eyes, replaced by a deep, familiar sorrow. She would grow quiet, her movements becoming tense and watchful, as if she expected the night itself to do her harm. One moonless night, unable to sleep, Eli rose from his bed and went to the kitchen for a drink of water. As he stood by the window, he saw a flicker of light from the direction of the old barn. He squinted, his heart giving a sudden, hard jolt. It was a lantern, its flame a tiny, defiant star in the oppressive dark. He watched as the light moved, realizing with a chill that someone was inside. And he knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. He pulled on his boots and slipped out the back door, moving silently through the tall grass, the dew cold on his trousers. He kept to the shadows, his instincts telling him not to intrude, only to observe. He stopped by the corner of the corral, where he could see the barn's main entrance. The large doors were slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling out onto the dirt. Clara was inside. She had set the lantern on an old crate, its light casting long, dancing shadows that made the cavernous space seem alive. She wasn't doing anything. She was simply sitting on the dirt floor, her back against the far wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was perfectly still, a small, solitary figure in a temple of decay. She stared at the spot on the floor where the loose board had groaned under her weight, her expression unreadable. It was a vigil, a pilgrimage to a place of pain. Eli stood there for what felt like an hour, a silent guardian in the dark. A storm of emotions raged within him, confusion, a fierce, aching pity, and a rising tide of anger. Not at her, but at the nameless, faceless thing that had hurt her so badly. What had happened in this place? What ghost was she communing with in the dead of night? He retreated as silently as he had come, the image of her small, haunted figure seared into his mind. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. The barn was no longer just an old building. It was a secret. It was a wound in the heart of his land, and it was poisoning the fragile peace he and Clara were trying to build. His grandfather had built that barn. It had been part of his family's story for decades. The thought that it held some darkness that was now entwined with his wife's was more than he could bear. The practical need for a new granary was now overshadowed by a desperate, burning need for the truth. He would not let her keep visiting her ghosts. He would tear the place down and let the sun burn them away. He didn't warn her. The next morning, after she had served him breakfast, he walked out of the house with a grim determination, carrying a heavy crowbar and a sledgehammer. He went straight to the barn, ignoring the questioning look from Silas, who was mending a bridle nearby. He set his jaw and slammed the head of the sledgehammer against the weathered gray planks of the side wall. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet morning air, a loud, splintering crack that echoed across the yard. Inside the house, Clara would have heard it. He knew she would have. He didn't care. This was something he had to do. He worked with a feverish energy, tearing at the boards, ripping them from their ancient nails. Sunlight streamed into the dark interior for the first time in years, illuminating swirling motes of dust. He worked his way inside, towards the back wall, towards the spot where she had sat the night before. He attacked the floorboards with the crowbar, the rotten wood groaning in protest before giving way with a screech of rusty nails. He pried up one board, then another, the smell of damp earth and decay rising up to meet him. And then he saw it. Beneath the main floorboards was a second, cruder layer of planks, clearly laid down after the original construction. They were mismatched and ill-fitting. His breath caught in his throat. This was a deliberate concealment. With a surge of adrenaline, he forced the tip of the crowbar under one of the planks and heaved. It came loose, revealing a square of perfect, unnatural blackness beneath. A hatch, a hidden cellar. His hands trembling, Eli reached down and pulled the hatch open. A wave of musty, cold air rushed out, a smell of earth and trapped time, of something profoundly wrong. He fetched the lantern from the house and, after a moment's hesitation, lowered himself down the crude wooden ladder into the dark. The cellar was small, no more than 10 feet square, with earthen walls. It was a dungeon. The lantern light flickered over the contents, and Eli felt the blood run cold in his veins. In one corner lay a set of small, rusted iron shackles, the size that would fit a child. Near them, balled up and covered in mildew, was a piece of clothing, a small, simple dress of coarse cotton, ripped at the shoulder. He saw a small stack of letters, their paper so brittle and water-damaged they were nearly illegible. But it was the last object that made his heart stop. Lying half-buried in the dirt was a small scrap of linen, perhaps from a handkerchief. It was dirty and frayed, but on it, stitched in what was once a neat, blue thread, were 2 initials and a name, Clara J. Clara. The air left his lungs in a rush. He felt dizzy, sickened. He stood there in the dark, beneath his family's barn, the terrible truth of the place settling on him like a shroud. This was not just a secret. It was an atrocity. He climbed out of the cellar, his movements stiff and robotic. He couldn't let her see this, not yet. He carefully replaced the floorboards, his mind racing. He gathered the pitiful, damning objects, the shackles, the tattered dress, the letters, and the embroidered scrap of linen, and wrapped them in an old saddle blanket. He saddled his horse, his hands working automatically, his gaze fixed on some distant, horrifying point. He had to know more. He rode the 5 miles to the older part of the settlement, where a few of the original families still lived. He went straight to the blacksmith's shop, a cavernous, soot-stained building that always smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. Bartholomew Barty Smith was a man as old as the town itself, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his arms still thick with muscle from a lifetime of hammering steel. He was the town's unofficial historian, a keeper of stories and secrets. Eli found him at the forge, hammering a glowing horseshoe into shape. Barty looked up as he entered, his pale blue eyes sharp and intelligent. "Eli, what trouble brings you out this way looking like you've seen a ghost?" Without a word, Eli unwrapped the bundle on a workbench, the clang of the small shackles echoing unnaturally in the smithy. Barty's hammering stopped. He put down his tools and came over, his expression grim. He picked up the shackle, turning it over in his huge, calloused hand. He looked at the tattered dress, his lips tightening into a thin line. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Under the old barn on my property," Eli said, his own voice hoarse. "There was a hidden cellar." Barty sighed, a long, weary sound, and looked out the wide door of the smithy as if seeing back through the years. "I had heard whispers," he said softly. "A long time ago, during the war, before your father's time, even. Your granddad was a hard man, but I don't think he ever knew. He bought that section of land from a fellow who passed through, a smooth-talking man with a Bible in his bag and a devil in his eyes." He paused, picking up the scrap of linen. "There was a nasty business back then, a ring of 'em. They preyed on the vulnerable, took in orphans, runaways, children of mixed blood, promised them homes back east. They'd hold them for a time, then sell them on to labor camps. Or worse, it was a dark time. People looked the other way. That barn, it was a way station on their route, a holding pen." Eli stared at the embroidered name in the old man's hand. Clara J. His Clara, a child, in a holding pen. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her terror of the barn, her nightmares, her guarded silence, the scars on her wrists. He felt a wave of rage so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He gathered the items, his hands shaking. "Thank you, Barty." "Be careful, son," the old blacksmith warned, his eyes full of pity. "Some truths are heavier than iron. They can break a man, or a woman." Eli nodded numbly and walked out into the blinding sun. The ride back to the ranch was a blur. The prairie, his home, his sanctuary, now seemed menacing and alien. He was no longer just a rancher, and Clara was no longer just his quiet, mail-order bride. He was the keeper of a horrific secret, and she was its survivor. He rode with the terrible weight of that knowledge, the dust from his horse's hooves rising behind him like a funeral shroud. The ride back was a torment. Every familiar landmark, the lone cottonwood, the gentle rise of the south pasture, the distant shape of his own house, was tainted, layered with a history he never knew it had. The land felt different under his horse's hooves, the soil seeded with a sorrow and a cruelty that was now his to carry. The bundle behind his saddle was a leaden weight, not just in mass, but in meaning. It was the physical proof of a nightmare, and he was bringing it home. He saw her as he crested the last ridge. She was on the porch, a small figure in a simple dress, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She had been waiting for him. A pang of something, guilt, pity, a furious protective instinct shot through him. She looked like any other rancher's wife, waiting for her husband, but she wasn't. She was a survivor of the very ground she stood on. When he dismounted, he couldn't meet her eyes. The silence that fell between them was a new and terrible kind. It was no longer the silence of strangers learning to live together. It was the silence of a secret unearthed, humming with tension and unspoken accusations. "Eli, is everything all right?" Her voice was small, laced with an anxiety she could no longer hide. She had felt the shift in him the moment he rode into the yard. His face was a mask of stone, his shoulders rigid with a strain that had nothing to do with a long day's work. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice a low rasp. He untied the bundle and carried it with him as he strode past her into the house. He didn't want to do this, but he knew he had to. The lie they were living had to be torn down, just like the barn. She followed him inside, her footsteps light and hesitant. "I've kept supper warm for you. It's just stew." He dropped the bundle onto the kitchen table with a heavy thud. The sound made her flinch. He turned to face her, the rage and confusion of the day churning in his gut. He looked at this woman, this stranger, and saw her for the first time. The haunted eyes, the ever-present tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. It all made a sickening kind of sense now. "You sensed it, didn't you?" she whispered, her gaze fixed on the saddle blanket. "In the barn, you felt that something was wrong." He ignored her question. He watched as she moved, almost by instinct, to the stove. Her hands, trembling slightly, reached for a bowl and a ladle. It was an act of desperate normalcy, an attempt to impose the simple ritual of a meal onto a moment that was cracking and splintering around them. She was trying to serve him dinner, to be the wife he had ordered, while the evidence of her shattered childhood lay on the table between them. He couldn't stand it. "Don't," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. She froze, the ladle hovering over the pot. She turned to him, her face pale and questioning. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the bundle and unfolded the blanket. The pathetic items lay exposed in the warm lamplight of the kitchen, the tattered dress, the cold iron of the shackles, and on top, the small, damning piece of embroidered linen. He picked it up between his thumb and forefinger and placed it on the clean wood of the table. "Clara J." Her eyes fell upon it. For a single, eternal second, there was no reaction. It was as if her mind refused to process what it was seeing. Then, a low, guttural sound escaped her throat, a noise of pure, animal pain. The porcelain bowl slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the floorboards and shattered, the sound as loud and final as a closing cell door. She didn't notice. Her entire being was focused on that scrap of cloth. She staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth, her back hitting the solid kitchen wall with a thud. She slid down it slowly, her legs giving way, until she was crumpled on the floor amidst the shards of the broken bowl. The carefully constructed woman named Clara May Jennings disappeared. In her place was a terrified child, staring at the ghost of her own name. "It was my mother's," she finally whispered, her voice a broken, hollow thing. "She gave it to me before they took me. She told me to never lose it, so I would always remember who I was." The story came out of her then, not in a steady narrative, but in jagged, painful fragments, torn from a place she had kept locked away for 16 years. She spoke of Boston, not of the noise and the stone, but of a man with a kind smile and a preacher's collar who had taken her in after her mother died. Her adoptive father, a pillar of his community. A man who spoke of God's love while running a shadow business built on the misery of children. "He told me we were going on a trip," she said, her eyes vacant, fixed on the past. "A missionary journey to help the less fortunate out west. There were other girls, too, all of us orphans. All of us told we were special, chosen." Her voice dropped lower, thick with a remembered horror. "This was one of the stops, that barn. He called them arresting places. We weren't allowed to make a sound. The men who worked for him, they weren't kind. We were kept in that hole, sometimes for days. It was so cold. And the dark," she shuddered, a violent tremor that shook her entire body. She was 9 years old again, huddled in the damp earth, listening to the rats scurry in the walls and the wind howl like a hungry wolf. Eli stood rooted to the spot, listening. Every word was a blow. He felt a wave of nausea. This man, a supposed man of God, had used his own family's land, his land, as a cage. The sense of violation was profound, a desecration that went deeper than earth and wood. It struck at the heart of his identity, his heritage. "How did you get away?" he asked, his voice rough. "There was a fire," she said, her words coming faster now. "One of the lanterns in the barn was knocked over. There was screaming, smoke, confusion. I just ran. I ran into the dark and didn't stop. I hid in the plains for days, living on nothing. By the time I made it to the next town, I was half dead. I told them my name was Jennings. I told them my family had died in a wagon fire. I never spoke of Boston, or of him again. I ended up in an orphanage in Missouri, and when I was old enough, I left. I have been running ever since." She finally looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her expression a raw plea for understanding. "When I saw your advertisement, Kansas, it felt far enough away. I thought I could finally stop running. I never knew it was the same place. I swear. Eli. Not until I stepped into that barn and heard that floorboard creak. It was like a memory from a nightmare. I wasn't sure. Not until now." Eli was a storm of conflicting emotions. A tidal wave of pity threatened to drown him. He looked at the broken woman on his floor and wanted to gather her up, to shield her from the world, to somehow erase the horrors she had endured. But beneath the pity was a current of hot, angry resentment. She had lied to him, not with her words, but with her silence. She had brought this poison into his home, into his life. He was now part of her nightmare. Whether he wanted to be or not, his life, his future, was tied to a secret that could destroy them both. "On my family's land. Clara," he said. The words ground out from between clenched teeth. "He kept you in a cage on my grandfather's land." The anger in his voice was the final blow. Her face crumpled. The last flicker of hope in her eyes died. With a choked sob, she scrambled to her feet and fled. She ran out the back door, disappearing into the rapidly falling night. For a moment, he let her go. He stood there, his fists clenched, his heart a battlefield. Pity fought anger. Love fought betrayal. He looked at the mess on the floor, the spilled stew, the shattered bowl, the relics of her captivity. This was his life now. A shambles. But then the image of her, small and terrified, running into the vast, dark prairie, broke through his rage. She was out there alone, running back to her ghosts. Cursing himself, he grabbed a lantern and went after her. He knew where she would go. He didn't even need to follow her tracks. He went straight to the old barn, its sagging silhouette a monstrous shape against the star-dusted sky. The door was open. He stepped inside, raising the lantern. The pit in the floor was open, a black, gaping mouth. "Clara?" A small, whimpering sound came from below. He lowered the lantern. She was there, in the cellar. She was curled into a tight ball in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had gone back to the cage. She had returned to the 9-year-old girl who had been trapped there. Something inside Eli broke. The anger, the resentment, it all washed away, replaced by an overwhelming, agonizing tenderness. He set the lantern down and lowered himself into the cellar. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and misery. He went to her, kneeling in the dirt. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and pulled her into his arms. She was stiff at first, resistant. Then, with a shuddering sigh, she collapsed against him, her body surrendering to a grief so profound it seemed to have no end. He held her tightly, rocking her gently, his hand stroking her hair. He was no longer a husband or a rancher. He was just a man, holding a broken woman in a hole in the ground, trying to offer his own warmth as a shield against the cold of the past. The prairie wind moaned outside, a lonely, desolate sound. He didn't know how long they stayed like that. But as her sobs quieted, the nature of his touch began to change. The embrace became less about comfort and more about a desperate, elemental need. He felt it in her, and he felt it in himself. A need to erase the horror of this place, to reclaim it, to fill it with something other than fear and pain. He tilted her face up to his, her eyes luminous with tears in the lantern light, searched his. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce, hungry, and desperate. It was a kiss full of all the rage, and all the sorrow, and all the unspoken words that had passed between them. It tasted of salt and dirt and a shared, profound loneliness. She responded with equal fire, her fingers digging into his shoulders, pulling him closer. There, in the dirt of her former prison. They came together. It was a raw and painful coupling, an act born not of romance, but of a brutal, shared humanity. It was a furious act of defiance against the ghosts that haunted the earthen walls. It was a punishment for the lies and a release from the pain, a desperate physical confirmation that they were alive, that they had survived. It was the only language they had left to speak, a collision of two damaged souls seeking solace in the heart of their shared trauma. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the dirt, their breathing ragged, the lantern casting a flickering, merciful light over them. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet, aching stillness in its wake. Eli held her, his heart hammering against his ribs, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had just done. A single, hot tear fell from her eye onto his cheek. He felt her take a shaky breath. "I don't deserve this," she whispered into the darkness, her voice choked with a fresh wave of despair. "I don't deserve to be loved." The night did not end in the cellar. After Clara's whispered confession of unworthiness, Eli felt the last of his own turmoil settle into a hard, clear resolve. He did not speak. Words were useless against a pain so old. Instead, he gathered her limp body from the dirt floor, wrapping her in his own coat against the chill, and carried her out of that dark hole and back into the house, leaving the ghosts and the lantern behind. He laid her in his own bed, the one Martha had died in, the one he had slept in alone for 2 years, and gently washed the dirt from her face and hands with a damp cloth. He sat in a chair beside the bed for the remainder of the night, watching her. He watched the fitful rhythm of her sleep, the way her brow would furrow and her hands would clench as unseen phantoms chased her through her dreams. In the deep stillness of the night, with only the ticking of the mantel clock and the sigh of the wind for company, he looked at her face, scrubbed clean by sleep of the years of fear and vigilance. She looked impossibly young, like a lost child who had finally stumbled into a safe harbor. Her dark hair was a wild tangle on the white pillowcase, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he saw not a mail-order bride, not a woman with a dark secret, but simply Clara, a person, a soul that had been grievously wounded and had somehow, miraculously, endured. The raw, desperate act in the cellar had not been about love, not the kind people wrote poems about. It had been something more primal, an acknowledgement of a shared wound, a furious declaration that they were both still alive. But now, watching her sleep, something else began to take root in his heart. It was a quiet, fierce tenderness, a protective instinct so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. He had entered into this arrangement seeking a companion to fill the silence. It had been a simple, selfish transaction. It was no longer simple. He was bound to her now, not by a letter or a preacher's words, but by the terrible knowledge he held and the shared intimacy of a dark hole in the ground. By sunrise, he knew what he had to do. He was a rancher, a man of the land, but this problem couldn't be solved with a strong back or a sturdy fence. This required a different kind of tool. He left before she woke, leaving a note on the kitchen table. Asterisk, gone to town. Be back by sundown. He saddled his horse and rode hard, the morning sun at his back. A cold purpose settled in his gut. He bypassed the general store and the saloon, heading straight for a small, neat, clapboard house on the edge of town, the home of Judge Miller, the circuit judge and town's only lawyer. Miller was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen the worst of human nature and had somehow retained a glint of wry humor. Eli found him on his porch, reading a book. The judge looked up over his spectacles. "Eli, it's early for a social call. Don't tell me your cattle have developed a taste for litigation." "I need your help, Judge," Eli said, his voice flat. "Or your advice. It's about a matter from the past." Miller gestured to the empty chair beside him. Eli remained standing. He couldn't bring himself to sit. The nervous energy was too great. He told the judge a heavily edited version of the story. He spoke of renovating an old barn and finding a hidden cellar, of discovering evidence that suggested it was used as a holding pen for a trafficking ring years ago. During the war, he mentioned finding personal items, including one with a name. He left Clara out of it entirely. The judge listened intently, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Eli finished, the old man was silent for a long time. "I remember the talk," he said finally. "Ugly rumors. Most folks didn't want to believe them. A ring dealing in orphans and runaways. They were clever, operated under the guise of piety, of saving lost souls. The law was thinner back then. It was never proven. The ring vanished after the war, and the stories faded into local legend. I need to know what you have." Eli pressed. "Any records, any names associated with it." Miller sighed and led Eli into his dusty office, a room overflowing with books and stacks of yellowed paper. For 2 hours, they pored over old territorial records and county ledgers. It was a frustrating, fruitless search. The names were all local, small-time criminals and drifters. There was nothing to connect the ring to anyone of importance, nothing that pointed back east. Just as Eli was about to give up, Miller paused, a thoughtful frown on his face. There was one other thing, something that never made it into an official file. He shuffled through a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thin, private ledger. "I keep my own notes. About 6, maybe 7 years after the war. A man came through here, a Pinkerton agent from back east. He was asking questions, quietly, about a girl who had disappeared from a prominent Boston family's care around that time. He said she was a runaway, a ward of the family. He had a name." Miller ran a gnarled finger down a page. "Here it is. He was looking for a Clara Jensen. Said she would have been about 10 or 11 at the time she vanished." Eli's blood ran cold. Clara J. "Did he find her?" "No. He followed a cold trail to Missouri and lost it. But it's the family that was interesting." Miller looked up at Eli, his eyes grim. The girl was the adoptive daughter of a very influential minister, a man who was gaining quite a reputation for his charity and his powerful sermons. A man named Thomas Albright. The name meant nothing to Eli. "He's not just a minister anymore." "Son," the judge said, closing the ledger. "For the last decade, he's been Bishop Albright, one of the most powerful, respected, and wealthiest churchmen on the East Coast. A man with friends in Washington. A man a long way from a dirt cellar in Kansas." He paused, his gaze sharp. "And a man who, according to the papers, still has people quietly looking for his lost, troubled ward, to bring her home." The threat was no longer a ghost from the past. It was a living, breathing thing with power and influence. It had a name, and it was looking for Clara. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. While Eli was in town unearthing the scope of the danger, Clara woke up alone in a strange bed. The morning light felt harsh, intrusive. The house was deathly quiet. She saw Eli's note on the kitchen table, and a cold dread washed over her. He had left her, after what had happened, after what she'd confessed. He had finally seen the ugly truth of her and ridden away. The thought was an icy certainty that settled deep in her bones. The day stretched before her, an eternity of silence and waiting. She moved through the house like a ghost, her own past now fully awake and sitting beside her at the table, following her from room to room. The brief, fragile sense of safety she had started to feel in this place was shattered. She was tainted. She had tainted his home with her story. A feverish need began to build in her, a compulsion she couldn't ignore. She had to erase it. She had to purge the last remnants of that time, of that girl. She went to the kitchen and found a small tin of matches, her hands shaking. She walked out of the house and across the yard, her feet carrying her inexorably toward the old barn. She didn't hesitate at the entrance. She went straight to the back, to the open wound in the floor. She climbed down into the cellar one last time. It was her tomb, her sanctuary, her place of judgment. Eli had taken the shackles and her mother's handkerchief, but the other things remained. The tattered child's dress, the stack of moldy letters she hadn't been able to bring herself to touch. With a strange, detached calm, she gathered them into a small pile in the center of the dirt floor. She held the small dress in her hands for a moment. It was made of rough, unforgiving fabric. She could almost feel the ghost of the terrified child who had worn it. With a sob, she dropped it onto the pile. She struck a match. The small flame sputtered, a tiny, defiant light in the oppressive gloom. She touched it to the edge of the brittle paper. The fire caught quickly, a pitiful, hungry flame that began to consume the last evidence of her ordeal. It licked at the rotten cotton of the dress, turning it to black ash. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to fill the small, enclosed space. Clara didn't move. She simply sat there, watching it burn, the heat a welcome, punishing sensation on her face. It was an offering, a funeral pyre. She was burning the girl she used to be, hoping to rise from the ashes as someone clean, someone new. But the smoke was thick and the air was thin. Her eyes began to stream, her lungs screaming for air. She started to cough, deep, racking coughs that shook her entire frame. The small cellar was now a smoke-filled trap. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The flames blurred, the single point of light in a swirling blackness that was starting to close in. Her last coherent thought was one of grim irony, that she would die here, in the very place she had once managed to escape. Then, the world went dark. Eli rode back with a heavy heart and a mind racing. Bishop Albright, a Pinkerton. The danger was real, and it was closing in. As he cleared the final rise, his eyes scanned the ranch, and his heart leaped into his throat. A thin, lazy wisp of gray smoke was curling out of the roof of the old barn. "No," he breathed, kicking his horse into a desperate gallop. He leaped from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop, his boots hitting the ground running. "Clara!" he roared, his voice raw with terror. He burst into the barn and was hit by a wall of smoke. He could see it pouring from the open hatch in the floor. He didn't hesitate. He covered his mouth and nose with his sleeve and plunged down the ladder. He found her immediately, a crumpled heap on the floor, terrifyingly still. The small fire was already dying out, starved of air. He scooped her up into his arms. She was limp, a dead weight. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped him. He scrambled up the ladder and carried her out into the clean, open air, laying her gently on the grass. Her face was smudged with soot, her lips blue. He pressed his ear to her chest. A heartbeat, faint, but it was there. Relief, so powerful it made him weak, washed over him. He ran to the water trough, soaked his bandana, and ran back, gently washing her face, calling her name over and over. Her eyelids fluttered. She coughed, a weak, rattling sound, and then began to draw in great, shuddering gulps of air. Her eyes opened, hazy and confused. Before focusing on his face, she saw the anger there, the sheer, terrified fury, and she flinched. "You foolish girl," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "What were you thinking? You could have died in there." Tears began to stream down her face, mixing with the soot. "I had to," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. "I had to burn it, to get rid of it. I've brought you nothing but trouble." "Eli." He knelt beside her, his anger dissolving into a profound, aching sorrow. He smoothed the hair back from her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. She looked at him, her eyes holding a lifetime of pain. "When I first came here," she confessed, the words tearing from her throat, "I thought about it, walking out into the prairie and not coming back, or finding the deepest part of the creek. I was so tired of running, so tired of being afraid." She took a ragged breath. "But then, there was you. You were quiet and kind. You didn't push. You gave me a place to be still. You are the only reason I'm still alive." Her confession struck him with the force of a physical blow. All this time, he had been focused on his own loneliness, his own needs. He had never considered the depth of the despair she had been living with every single day. He leaned down and gathered her into his arms again, holding her close against his chest. "Don't you ever think that again," he murmured into her hair. "Don't you ever think you're a trouble to me." That night, he led her back to his room. This time, there was no desperation, no violence, no pain. In the soft gray of the pre-dawn light, he undressed her slowly, reverently. He looked at her not as a secret to be uncovered, but as a person to be known. He traced the faint, silvery scars on her wrists with his fingertips, not with pity, but with a kind of awe at her resilience. When they came together, it was with a gentleness that was entirely new. It was a deliberate, quiet exploration, a silent promise. It was an act of profound and tender healing, a soft and steady light chasing away the last of the shadows. It was not the desperate collision of two lonely people in the dark. It was warm, and it was gentle, as soft and as welcome as a cool wind blowing through a harsh desert. As they lay in each other's arms, watching the first blush of pink paint the eastern sky, they were not a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were simply two people who had found a reason to face the sunrise. The fragile peace they had forged was as delicate as a spider's web in the morning dew, and just as easily broken. For a few weeks, however, it held. A new kind of quiet settled over the Granger ranch, one born not of distance and fear, but of a shared, unspoken understanding. They worked side by side, moving in a comfortable orbit around each other. He would be in the corral mending a harness, and she would bring him a dipper of cool water from the well, their fingers brushing in the exchange. She would be kneading dough in the kitchen, and he would come in from the fields and stand for a moment, just watching the methodical, comforting rhythm of her work. The nights were a sanctuary. In the quiet darkness of his room, they learned each other not through words, but through touch. They discovered that gentleness could be a greater solace than passion, that a hand held in the dark could offer more protection than a locked door. Eli found himself sleeping more soundly than he had in years. The cold space in his bed filled not just with another body, but with a warmth that seeped into his very bones. For Clara, the nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their sharp edges blunted by the steady presence of the man sleeping beside her. For the first time since she was a small child, she did not feel entirely alone in the world. But the world was larger than the boundaries of the Granger ranch. Trouble, once set in motion, rarely stops of its own accord. It began as a whisper in town, a seed of curiosity planted by a Pinkerton agent's questions months earlier, now watered by the gossip that flows like a river through any small community. The story of Eli Granger, the stoic widower, and his sudden, silent bride from the East was intriguing enough on its own. But whispers have a way of growing, of twisting. The quiet bride became the secretive bride. And then, somehow, the hunted bride. Eli felt the change the next time he rode in for supplies. He felt it in the way conversations would halt when he entered the general store, only to resume in hushed tones when he moved down an aisle. He saw it in the sideways glances from men who had known him his whole life, a new, calculating curiosity in their eyes. Old man Hemlock, the storekeeper, was a little too effusive, a little too quick with his questions. "That wife of yours settling in all right, Eli? Quiet one, ain't she? From back east, they say." Eli's answers were short and clipped, his face giving nothing away. But as he loaded his wagon, he saw a stranger standing across the street, leaning against the assayer's office. The man was dressed in city clothes, a bowler hat on his head, but he had the hard, watchful eyes of a wolf. Their gazes met for a moment across the dusty street, and Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The world was coming for them. It arrived a week later on a blistering hot afternoon. Eli was reinforcing a corral post when he saw the lone rider approaching, not from the main road, but cutting across the south pasture. The rider moved with an easy, arrogant confidence, and Eli knew, with a grim certainty, who he was. Clara saw him too, from the kitchen window. She gave a small, sharp gasp. "Eli," she breathed, her voice tight with panic. "Go inside," he said, not turning around, his voice low and firm. "Go up to the loft. Don't make a sound, and don't come down, no matter what you hear." She didn't argue. He heard the back door of the house close softly. He laid his hammer down and stood waiting. His arms crossed over his chest, a solid, immovable object planted in the Kansas soil. The rider reined in his horse a few feet away. He was a man in his 40s, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a smug, superior air. He dismounted, his movements smooth and practiced. He was not a cowboy. He was something else. "Eli Granger?" the man asked, his voice carrying an oily politeness. "That's me." "Name's Hobbs. I'm a private agent, hired to locate a missing person." He produced a folded piece of paper from his inner coat pocket. "I'm looking for a young woman. Goes by the name Clara Jensen. Sometimes Jennings, about this tall, dark hair, gray eyes. Last seen in Missouri some years back. Word is, a woman fitting her description arrived here a few months ago." Eli's face was a granite mask. "You've been misinformed. My wife is from Ohio. Her name is Martha." He used his first wife's name, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Hobbs smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Is that so? Funny thing about small towns. People talk. They say your wife is a quiet woman, keeps to herself, almost like she has something to hide." He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the ranch house. "I have a warrant for her return to her legal guardian. There's a substantial reward, $500. A man could do a lot with that kind of money. You wouldn't be hiding her from me, would you? Granger? Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense." The accusation hung in the hot, still air, from a small, grimy window in the hayloft. Clara watched, her body trembling so violently she had to bite her own hand to keep from making a sound. She saw Eli, standing his ground, saw the coiled tension in his shoulders. "My wife is in the house, resting," Eli said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "She's not feeling well. You're not welcome here. Get on your horse and ride out." "I don't think so," Hobbs said, his smugness growing. "I think I'll just have a look for myself. If you have nothing to hide." He made to step past Eli toward the house. Eli moved so fast he was a blur. He blocked the man's path, his body a solid wall of muscle. "You're not setting foot in my house." Hobbs's eyes narrowed. "You're a fool, hiding some runaway girl who's clearly got you wrapped around her finger. For all you know, she's a thief or a murderess. This Bishop Albright is a powerful man. You think a dirt-scrabbling rancher like you can stand in his way?" He made a fatal mistake. He jabbed a finger into Eli's chest. Something in Eli snapped. All the fear, all the rage, all the protective fury he felt for the woman hiding in his loft coalesced into a single, explosive point. He didn't say a word. His right fist shot out, a hard, calloused knot of bone and muscle, and connected squarely with Hobbs's jaw. The crack of the impact was sharp and loud. Hobbs staggered backward, a look of pure shock on his face, before his legs gave out and he crumpled into the dust. Eli stood over him, breathing heavily, his fist throbbing. The brief satisfaction was immediately replaced by a cold dread. He had just assaulted an agent of the law. Hobbs spat out a tooth and a stream of blood. He slowly pushed himself up, his face a mask of fury. "You'll regret that, Granger," he hissed. "You'll regret that for the rest of your short life." He scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, leaving Eli standing alone in the silent yard. The consequences came the next morning. The town sheriff, a man named Davies, whom Eli had known since they were boys, rode out with a deputy. Davies looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting everywhere but at Eli's face. "Eli," he began. "Mr. Hobbs filed a complaint. Assault. He also claims you're harboring a fugitive. I don't want to believe it, but he has papers signed by a judge back east. The magistrate wants to see you. Now." From the window, Clara watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest. This was her fault. Her past had finally caught up to her, and now it was dragging Eli down with it. She watched as he spoke to the sheriff, his posture proud and unyielding. She saw him nod, turn, and walk to his own horse. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't want her to see the worry in his eyes. She watched him ride away, flanked by the two lawmen, a prisoner on his own land. As they disappeared over the rise, she sank to the floor and let out a strangled sob, a sound of pure, undiluted guilt. The journey back from town was tense. The magistrate had been stern, releasing Eli on his own recognizance but ordering him to appear for a formal hearing in 2 days' time, and to turn over the woman known as Clara Jensen. It was a temporary reprieve, nothing more. As Eli rode, his mind was a whirlwind. How could he protect her? Where could they go? The world suddenly felt very small. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the two riders until they were on him. They came out of a small, wooded ravine, their faces covered with bandanas. He recognized Hobbs's horse. It wasn't an arrest. It was an ambush. He had no time to react. A heavy, blunt object, a pistol butt or a club, crashed against the side of his head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He tumbled from the saddle, hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. He was vaguely aware of boots kicking him in the ribs, of a voice snarling, "This is a message from the bishop." Then, the world dissolved into a deep, silent blackness. Back at the ranch, Clara paced the floor like a caged animal. Every passing hour was an eternity. The sun began to sink, bleeding color across the western sky. And still, there was no sign of him. A terrible fear began to take root in her heart, a fear that was colder and sharper than any she had ever known for herself. This was different. This was fear for him. She couldn't stand it any longer. The instinct that had screamed at her for 16 years, "Hide, run, disappear," was being drowned out by a new, more powerful voice. The voice that whispered of his kindness, of his gentle touch, of the safety she had found in his arms. He had stood up for her. He had taken a blow for her. She could not let him face this alone. In a decision that went against every fiber of her being, she ran from the house, not away from the danger, but towards it. She was not a skilled rider, but she managed to get a bridle on Eli's fastest horse, with her heart hammering against her ribs. She hauled herself into the saddle and kicked the horse into a desperate, frantic gallop towards town. She, who had spent her life running from the world, was now riding to confront it. She found him a mile from town, a crumpled shape on the side of the road, his horse grazing placidly nearby. A scream tore from her throat. She slid from the horse and ran to his side. He was unconscious, his face pale and bruised, a nasty gash on his temple still sluggishly bleeding. For one terrifying moment, she thought he was dead. Then she saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. Sobbing his name, she cradled his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his blood-stained face. Then, the adrenaline kicked in. She climbed back on her horse and rode into town like a fury, her hair flying behind her, her face a mask of desperate resolve. She burst into the blacksmith's shop, her voice hoarse and cracking. "It's Eli! He's been ambushed on the road! Help him! Please! Someone help him!" Barty Smith and 2 other men were there in minutes with a wagon. They brought Eli back to the ranch, carrying him inside and laying him on his own bed. Clara took over then, a quiet, fierce efficiency possessing her. She sent the men away, promising she could manage. This was her responsibility, her penance. She worked through the night, her exhaustion forgotten. With trembling hands, she cleaned his wounds, stitching the gash on his head with a needle and thread from her sewing kit. She bathed his face, gently washing away the blood and dirt. She brewed a strong, bitter poultice of herbs and applied it to his bruised ribs. She did it all with a meticulous, focused attention, as if each careful act could somehow undo the damage her presence had caused. She was no longer just a wife. She was a nurse, a guardian, a keeper of the flame of his life. She sat in the chair by his bed, watching him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, as if she could will her own strength into him. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she didn't leave. She simply laid her head down on the edge of the mattress, her cheek resting near his hand, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Sometime in the gray light of dawn, Eli's eyes fluttered open. The world came back to him slowly, through a thick fog of pain. His head throbbed, his ribs ached with every breath. He turned his head, a groan escaping his lips, and saw her. She was asleep, her face etched with exhaustion, her dark hair falling across the covers. Her small hand was inches from his. He saw the dried tear tracks on her cheeks, the faint smudges of dirt and blood she hadn't managed to wash away. She had stayed. She hadn't run. She had ridden for help. She had saved him. He felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost stole his breath. It was more than tenderness, more than desire, more than responsibility. It was a profound, unshakable certainty. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. She stirred but didn't wake. He looked at her, this small, brave, broken woman who had upended his entire world, and a whisper escaped his lips, a plea spoken for the first time in his life, directed not at God, but at her. Don't go anywhere. Eli's recovery was slow, measured not in days, but in the small victories of living. The first time he sat up without the world spinning. The first time he could draw a full breath without a sharp, stabbing pain in his ribs. Through it all, Clara was a constant, quiet presence. She was no longer the timid, fearful woman who had stepped off the stagecoach. The ambush had burned away the last of her hesitation, reforging her in the crucible of fear for another. She was now a guardian, fierce and tender in equal measure. She changed his bandages with steady hands, her touch gentle but firm. She brewed foul-smelling herbal teas that she insisted he drink, meeting his grimaces with an unyielding look that allowed no argument. She read to him in the long afternoons from a worn copy of Shakespeare that had belonged to his mother, her voice soft and even, a soothing balm on the raw edges of his pain. In the quiet intimacy of the sick room, they learned the landscape of each other's faces, the cadence of each other's breathing. They spoke little, but their silence was a conversation, a shared language of resilience. The attack had changed everything. The threat was no longer a shadowy possibility. It had a face, a name, and it had drawn blood. The hearing in town was postponed due to Eli's injuries, a temporary stay of execution granted by a sympathetic magistrate who disliked outside agents throwing their weight around. But they both knew it was only a matter of time. They could not hide forever. It was Clara who made the first move. A week after Eli was steady enough on his feet to walk the length of the porch, she came to him as he sat watching the sunset. "I'm going to market tomorrow," she said, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. Eli turned to look at her. Her jaw was set. Her shoulders were back. There was a new steel in her spine. "Clara, you don't have to. I can ask Luke to fetch the supplies." "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "I am not a ghost. I will not be hidden away in this house as if I am something to be ashamed of. I am your wife. I will go to the market." He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes and felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost hurt. He simply nodded. "All right, we'll go together." The next morning, they rode into town in the wagon. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Clara sat straight-backed on the bench beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She was wearing her best dress, a simple calico she had mended herself, and her hair was neatly pinned. It was a suit of armor, carefully chosen for the battle ahead. As they rolled down the main street, the town's reaction was immediate and palpable. It was as if a silent signal had been sent. Conversations on the boardwalks faltered and died. Men leaning against posts straightened up to stare. Women sweeping their porches stopped mid-sweep, their gazes following the wagon with a mixture of suspicion and avid curiosity. It was a gauntlet of 100 silent judgments. Clara kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but Eli could feel the tremors running through her. He reached over and laid his large, calloused hand over hers. He didn't squeeze or pat, he simply covered her hands with his. A silent, solid message. Asterisk, I am here. You are not alone. She visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping a fraction, and she drew a quiet, steadying breath. Their first stop was the Mercantile, the social hub of the town, run by a woman named Agnes Gable, Mrs. Gable was a formidable widow with a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye for gossip. As they entered, the handful of customers inside fell silent. The air crackled. Mrs. Gable stood behind her counter, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of stern neutrality. Eli began to list the items they needed: flour, salt, coffee, beans, his voice calm and steady, defying the hostile atmosphere of the room. As he spoke, Clara did something that shocked him. She released her hands from her lap and began to walk slowly down the main aisle, inspecting the bolts of cloth. It was a small act of defiance, a refusal to stand meekly by his side like a prisoner. She was claiming her right to be there. When Eli finished his list, Mrs. Gable began to tally the cost, her movement slow and deliberate. She looked past Eli, her sharp eyes fixing on Clara, who was now examining a display of ribbons. So, Mrs. Gable said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent room. You're the one. Clara turned, her face pale but composed. Ma'am? The one who's got Rancher Granger in a world of trouble, the woman continued, her tone accusatory. Got him beaten on the road, summoned before the magistrate. He was a respected man before you came along. Who are you, girl, to make a good man go so crazy he'd throw his whole life away for you? The question was a slap in the face. It was the voice of the entire town, of all their suspicion and judgment, given form. Eli tensed, ready to step in, to tell Agnes Gable to mind her own damn business. But before he could speak, something extraordinary happened. A small, slow smile touched Clara's lips. It was the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It wasn't a smile of happiness or joy. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated strength, a quiet acknowledgement of a hard-won truth. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the resilient woman who had been hiding underneath. She met the shopkeeper's hard gaze without flinching. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady, and it carried to every corner of the silent store. I am the last person, she said, who dares to love him, even though he knows exactly who I am. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer hostile. It was stunned. Mrs. Gable's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked from Clara's calm, smiling face to Eli's, who was staring at his wife with an expression of raw, undisguised awe. The shopkeeper's hard facade cracked. She looked down at her ledger, cleared her throat, and said, in a much softer voice, That'll be $4.20. Mr. Granger. They left the store and walked back into the sunlight, the town's gaze still on them. But something had shifted. The whispers would continue, but they would now be tinged with a grudging respect. Clara had not defended herself. She had simply stated a truth, and in doing so, had claimed her own power. The ride home was quiet, but it was a comfortable, peaceful silence. As the ranch came into view, Eli looked over at her. I've never been prouder of anyone in my entire life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She looked at him, her smile gone, but the new light still in her eyes. He needed to be loved, Eli, so did I. In the weeks that followed, they began to rebuild. They lived a simple, quiet life. But the foundation of it was now solid rock instead of shifting sand. And one morning, Eli went out to the old barn with a sledgehammer and a crowbar. This time, he wasn't driven by anger, but by a need to create. Clara came out and stood beside him. "What are you doing?" "Tearing down this monument to misery," he said, "and building something new in its place. A proper barn, with light and air and a solid foundation." She didn't protest. She simply went back to the house and returned with a pair of work gloves. "Show me what to do." And so, they began to build together. They worked from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic sound of hammering and sawing filling the air. He taught her how to measure a board, how to drive a nail straight and true. She learned quickly, her small hands surprisingly strong and capable. The work was hard, physical, and profoundly healing. With every rotten board they tore out, they were tearing down a piece of the past. With every new, sweet-smelling pine plank they nailed into place, they were building a future. They were, nail by nail, board by board, building a home. One evening, exhausted and sore, they sat on the frame of the new barn, watching the stars appear in the deepening twilight. "We should put a big window up there," she said, pointing to the west-facing wall, "so we can see the sunsets." "All right," he agreed. "A big window it is." It was the most hopeful conversation either of them had ever had. The letter arrived a few days later. Brought out from town by Luke, it was from Judge Miller. Eli took it with a sense of foreboding, the fragile peace of the last few weeks shattering like glass. He opened it and read it, his back to Clara as she washed the supper dishes. She heard the sharp intake of his breath. She turned, drying her hands on her apron. "Eli, what is it?" He didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally turned around, his face was pale, his expression grim. The hope that had begun to live in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fear she recognized all too well. "It's about your adoptive father," he said, his voice flat. "Bishop Albright. He's no longer just a powerful churchman. Clara, he's announced his intention to run for governor of his state." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A governor. The power that represented was immense, terrifying, and utterly beyond their ability to fight. "The judge says Albright's people are doubling their efforts," Eli continued, his voice strained. "They're not just looking for a runaway ward anymore. A man running for high office can't have a potential witness to his past crimes out in the world. You're not just an inconvenience now. Clara, you're a threat, a dangerous one." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. All the progress she had made, all the strength she had found, it all crumbled to dust. She had been a fool to think they could win. She had dragged this good, decent man into a fight against a giant, and now that giant was poised to crush them both. She looked at Eli's face, at the new lines of worry etched there, and she knew what she had to do. It was the only thing she could do. It was a choice born not of fear, but of a love so fierce and so complete that it demanded the ultimate sacrifice. That night, she lay beside him in the dark, pretending to be asleep. She listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing, memorizing the sound. She stored away the feel of his warmth beside her, the solid, comforting weight of his arm thrown over her waist. When his breathing deepened into the heavy sleep of exhaustion, she slipped carefully from the bed, moving silently in the moonlight. She dressed and packed a small bag with only what she had arrived with. She went to the kitchen and, by the light of a single candle, wrote a short, tear-blotted letter. Asterisk, my dearest Eli. Asterisk, you are the only reason I'm still alive. Please, let that be the reason you understand why I must go. They will not stop until they find me, and I will not be the reason they destroy you. Forget me. Rebuild your barn. Live a long and peaceful life. You deserve that. I love you. Forgive me. Asterisk, Clara, asterisk. She left the note on the kitchen table, where he had once left one for her. She took one last lingering look around the small, warm house that had become the only true home she had ever known. Then, she slipped out into the night. A cold wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain. She saddled the gentlest mare, her hands clumsy with grief. As she rode away from the ranch, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, plastering her hair to her cheeks and mingling with the silent tears streaming down her face. Eli woke just before dawn to a sense of profound and utter emptiness. The space beside him was cold. He sat up, his heart beginning to hammer in his chest. "Clara?" Silence. He threw on his clothes and strode into the kitchen. He saw the letter immediately. He snatched it up, his hands shaking as he read her neat, contained script. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. "Forget me." A strangled roar of pure anguish and fury tore from his throat. He crumpled the letter in his fist and ran. He didn't bother with a coat. He burst out of the house into the lashing rain, saddled his strongest horse with a frantic, desperate energy, and launched himself into the saddle. He kicked the horse into a reckless, headlong gallop, chasing a small, lone figure into a storm that had just begun. The rain was a physical assault. It came down in cold, driving sheets, turning the prairie soil into a slick, greedy mud that sucked at the horse's hooves. Eli rode into the heart of it, his hat long gone, his hair plastered to his skull, his shirt soaked through and clinging to his skin like a second, colder flesh. He didn't feel the chill. A fire of pure, desperate anguish burned in his chest, a heat so intense it rendered the storm irrelevant. He pushed the horse harder than he ever had before, the animal's breath coming in great, ragged bursts. With every jarring stride, a memory, sharp and vivid, lanced through him. He saw her as she first arrived, a small, frightened bird in a vast, empty sky. He felt the cold, trembling weight of her hand in his the night she fainted. He saw her face in the flickering lamplight of the cellar, a mask of old horrors, and he tasted the desperate salt and dirt kiss that had bound them together in that wretched hole. He remembered the quiet pride on her face as she stood up to Agnes Gable, the surprising strength in her hands as they worked together to frame the new barn, the soft, trusting weight of her body curled against his in the dark. Forget me. The words from her letter were a repeating lash against his mind. How could he forget? She was woven into the fabric of his life now, into the very land itself. The half-built barn was a monument to their shared hope. The house was filled with the scent of her, the quiet order of her presence. The cold space in his bed was a wound. He had lived with loneliness before. The quiet, aching emptiness left by Martha's passing. This was different. This was an amputation. Tears streamed from his eyes, hot and useless, mingling with the cold rain on his face. He wasn't crying for himself. He was crying for her, for the terrible, twisted love that had convinced her that disappearing was the only way to protect him. He had seen her run her whole life, from a past that was relentless in its pursuit. But this time, she wasn't running from fear. She was running from love. And that, he knew, was a far more powerful and dangerous motivation. He had no direction, only instinct. She would be trying to put as much distance between them as possible. She would be heading for the one thing that could carry her away faster than any horse, the railroad. The depot was 20 miles away. A hard ride in good weather, a fool's errand in a storm like this. But he knew she would try. He urged his horse on, whispering promises of rest and grain into the wind, begging the animal for a strength neither of them possessed. The world was a gray, streaming blur of mud and sky. He rode for hours, his body a single, throbbing ache, his mind locked on a single image. Clara, alone, heading toward a machine that would swallow her up and carry her back into the shadows. He reached the outskirts of the rail town as dusk was bleeding into a bruised, stormy night. The single street was a river of mud. the lights from the saloon and the hotel reflecting in the deep puddles. At the end of the street stood the depot, a squat, dark building with yellow light spilling from its windows. A train stood on the tracks, steam hissing from its great iron engine like an impatient beast, its single headlamp cutting a bright, hazy cone through the rain. It was the last train east until morning. He was running out of time. He swung down from his exhausted horse, his legs nearly buckling under him. He stumbled through the mud toward the depot, his heart hammering against his ribs. The platform was a chaos of frantic activity. People huddled under the narrow overhang, shouting goodbyes, porters wrestling with trunks, the conductor yelling, "All aboard!" The train's bell began to clang, a slow, funereal toll. He scanned the crowd, his eyes darting from face to face, a cold panic seizing him. He didn't see her. Had he been wrong? Had she gone another way? Had he lost her? The whistle blew, a long, mournful shriek that seemed to mock his desperation. The great wheels of the engine began to grind, 2 inches forward. And then he saw her. She was standing at the very last car, her hand on the railing, 1 foot on the first step. She was a small, solitary figure about to be absorbed into the belly of the iron beast. Her face was pale and set, her shoulders hunched against the rain and the weight of her decision. She was not looking back. "Clara!" His voice was a raw, broken roar, torn from the very depths of his soul. It cut through the noise of the train and the crowd. She froze, her body going rigid, slowly. She turned her head. Her eyes, wide and full of a terrible, heartbreaking anguish, met his across the crowded platform. He didn't hesitate. He pushed his way through the crowd, shoving people aside without apology. "Let me through," he growled. His focus narrowed to the single point of her. He reached the side of the train just as it was beginning to pick up speed. He lunged, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Let go, Eli!" she cried, her voice cracking. "You have to let me go! It's the only way!" "No!" he yelled, pulling her off the step and onto the platform, away from the moving train. He dragged her a few feet away from the tracks, into the thickest part of the crowd, and spun her around to face him. He gripped both of her shoulders, his hold desperate, possessive. Rain and tears streamed down both their faces, blurring the world around them into a swirl of light and shadow. "You don't get to decide that for me," he raged, his voice thick with all the pain and fear of the last several hours. "You don't get to ride in here and turn my whole world upside down and make me feel again, and then decide to just disappear because you think you're not worthy. You think I care about your past? You think I care about some ghost in a bishop's collar?" He shook her slightly, his control fraying. "I don't need you to be perfect, Clara. I just need you not to be gone." The words, torn from him in a paroxysm of raw, unfiltered truth, struck her with the force of a physical blow. The fight went out of her. The rigid lines of her resolve dissolved. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and she collapsed against him, her face buried in his chest. His arms went around her, crushing her to him. He buried his face in her wet hair, his own body shaking with the violent aftermath of his terror. "Don't you ever run from me again?" he murmured, his voice a ragged whisper against her ear. "Ever?" She looked up at him, her gray eyes luminous with tears. And in the middle of the chaotic, rain-swept train platform, surrounded by strangers and the dying sounds of the departing train, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperation or of healing. It was a kiss of claiming. It was fierce and deep and absolute, a public declaration sealed in the middle of a storm. It tasted of rain and salt and the unshakable certainty that they were no longer two separate people, but one single, defiant entity. The world, with its judgments and its dangers, fell away, leaving only the two of them, clinging to each other as if they were the only solid thing in a dissolving universe. The ride back was a stark contrast to his ride out. The storm had broken, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. A sliver of moon peeked through the tattered clouds, casting a pale, silvery light over the prairie. They rode on a single horse. Clara seated in front of him, her body leaning back against his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. They were both exhausted, soaked to the bone, but a profound, quiet peace had settled between them. The decision had been made. The running was over. The next day, Eli acted. He walked into town with Clara at his side. He didn't put her in the wagon. They walked, hand in hand, down the center of the muddy street. He felt the stares, heard the whispers start up again. He ignored them. He walked up the steps of the general store, turned to face the gathering onlookers, and stopped. Agnes Gable came to the door of her store. The sheriff paused on his rounds. A few ranchers who had been loitering on the boardwalk fell silent. Eli's voice was not loud, but it carried in the still air with the clear, ringing authority of a bell. "For any of you who are wondering," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This is Clara Granger. This is my wife." He looked down at Clara, his expression softening. "She will be treated with the respect she is due. Anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with me." He didn't wait for a reaction. He turned, still holding her hand, and led her to Judge Miller's office. He laid it all out for the old judge, the whole story, from the beginning. He told him about Bishop Thomas Albright and about the Pinkerton agent. Then he placed the small, wrapped bundle on the desk, the child's dress, the rusted shackles, and the small, embroidered handkerchief that had started it all. The judge looked at the evidence, then at Clara, who stood pale but resolute by Eli's side. A grim, hard light entered the old man's eyes. "What do you want to do, son?" Miller asked. "I want to fight," Eli said, his voice cold and hard as iron. "He has power and money. We have the truth. I want to send it to the biggest newspaper back east, the one that can't be bought, the one that would love to bring down a man like Albright." For the next 2 days, they worked. The judge, his legal mind sharp and incisive, helped Clara write out her story in a sworn affidavit, his questions gentle but probing, ensuring every detail was accurate and undeniable. Eli wrote his own statement, describing his discovery in the barn. They packaged the affidavit with a letter from the judge and the physical evidence, and sent it by express rider to a contact Miller had at the New York Herald. When it was done, a strange calm settled over them. They had taken their stand. They had turned from prey into hunters. The town, predictably, was split. Some saw Eli as a fool, a man throwing his life away for a woman of questionable character. They would cross the street to avoid him, their face set in grim disapproval. But others saw something else. They saw a man standing by his wife against impossible odds. Old Barty the blacksmith would give him a slow, approving nod. Agnes Gable began saving Clara the best cuts of bacon. They were still outsiders, still the subject of gossip and speculation, but they were no longer entirely alone. Eli faced the division with a quiet, unshakable resolve. Let them talk. He had his wife by his side, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The waiting was a unique form of torment. After the express rider had taken their package, a profound quiet descended upon the ranch, a stillness that felt like the held breath before a storm. They had fired their only shot, and now they could do nothing but wait for the echo. They threw themselves into the work of the new barn, finding a strange solace in the repetitive, physical labor. They measured, sawed, and hammered, the clean, sharp scent of fresh pine filling the air, a fragrance of creation that slowly began to overpower the lingering scent of decay from the old structure. News from the east trickled in slowly, arriving in week-old newspapers that Judge Miller would bring out from town. At first, there was nothing. Eli and Clara would scan the pages with a tense, hungry anxiety, only to find stories of politics in Washington and society balls in New York. Clara began to despair, the fear that their small, desperate truth had been swallowed and dismissed by a world that didn't care beginning to take root. Then, one sweltering afternoon in late summer, the judge rode out to the ranch, his face alight with a grim sort of triumph. He was holding a copy of the New York Herald, its front page dominated by a headline in stark, black letters. Asterisk, asterisk, Bishop. Albright, saint or sinner. Whispers of a secret past plague, gubernatorial hopeful. They read it together, standing in the shade of the half-finished barn, their heads bent close over the newsprint. The story was a masterpiece of insinuation and carefully presented facts. It spoke of an anonymous source, a sworn affidavit from a survivor, and physical evidence unearthed on a remote Kansas homestead. It detailed the operations of a wartime trafficking ring that preyed on orphans under the guise of Christian charity. It didn't convict Albright in the court of law, but it tried and sentenced him in the court of public opinion. The echo had arrived, and it was a thunderclap. In the weeks that followed, the story exploded. Other papers picked it up. Reporters, like vultures scenting a kill, began to dig into Albright's past. They found other whispers, other inconsistencies, other charitable ventures that seemed to have more shadow than light. Albright's carefully constructed facade of piety began to crack and crumble under the relentless scrutiny. He issued a furious denial, calling the story a vile slander concocted by his political enemies. But the damage was done. The physical evidence, a child's shackle, a tattered dress, was too visceral, too damning to be dismissed as mere politics. The fall was swift and brutal. His largest donors withdrew their support. The church, seeking to distance itself from the scandal, quietly asked for his resignation. Less than a month after the first story broke, a small, buried article on an inner page of the paper announced that Bishop Thomas Albright had withdrawn from the governor's race, citing failing health. And then, he simply vanished from public life, disappearing into a self-imposed exile, his name forever stained, his power broken, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of power. He had been defeated not by an army or a lawman, but by the quiet, persistent truth of a woman he had tried to erase. For Eli and Clara, the news was not a cause for celebration. There was no joy, no triumphant gloating. There was only a profound, quiet relief, the feeling of a crushing weight being lifted from their shoulders. The ghost that had haunted Clara for 16 years had finally been laid to rest. The hunt was over. A week after Albright's withdrawal from the race, another letter arrived. It was not from a judge or a newspaper. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Clara opened it with a sense of trepidation. Inside, the letter was brief. Asterisk, dear Miss Jensen. Asterisk, I read about you in the papers. My name is Sarah. I was in that barn. 2, I was a few years older than you. I remember a little girl with a blue handkerchief who cried in the dark. I think it was you. Asterisk, I never told anyone. I was too ashamed, too afraid. I thought I was the only one. When I read your story, I felt seen. For the first time in 20 years, I did not feel alone. Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to speak the truth for all of us who could not. Asterisk, you are not what happened to you. You are the woman who survived it. I hope you have found peace. Asterisk, sincerely. Asterisk, asterisk, a friend. Clara read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. The words were a balm on a wound she didn't even know was still bleeding. All her life, her trauma had been a solitary burden, an island of pain. Sarah's letter was a bridge. It was the quiet, powerful voice of another survivor, a shared testimony that validated her own. She was not a singular monster, a uniquely damaged thing. She was one of many, and she was not alone. She wept, but for the first time in her life, her tears were not of sorrow or of fear. They were tears of pure, unadulterated release. That evening, as they sat on the porch, she showed the letter to Eli. He read it and handed it back to her, his eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding. "He took your name," Eli said softly. "But he couldn't take your story. It was always yours." The first frost had silvered the prairie grass when Eli turned to her one morning as they were laying the final shingles on the roof of the new barn. "Marry me, Clara," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of what already was. She looked at him, her face smudged with tar, a hammer in her hand. A slow, true smile spread across her face. "I thought I already had." "We'll make it official," he said. "Proper." Their wedding was not held in the town's small, stuffy church. It was held on a bright, crisp autumn afternoon, under the sprawling branches of the ancient cottonwood tree that stood between the house and the new barn. The place that had once been the site of her deepest terror, the boundary of her cage, was now the backdrop for her greatest joy. The new barn stood behind them, solid and smelling of fresh pine, a testament to what they had built together. Its large, west-facing window, her idea, was already in place, ready to catch the sunsets. The guests were few. Judge Miller, looking more like a proud father than a man of the law, officiated. Barty the blacksmith stood as Eli's witness, his huge frame clad in an ill-fitting Sunday suit. And to Clara's surprise, Agnes Gable from the Mercantile was there, a peace offering of a freshly baked apple pie in her hands, her sharp features softened with a rare, genuine smile. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton she had ordered from a catalog, the same color as the one she had arrived in, but this one was new, unburdened by the past. Eli wore the same suit he had worn to meet her stagecoach, but this time it didn't seem stiff or funereal. It seemed right. The judge's words were simple and from the heart, speaking not of laws and contracts, but of resilience, courage, and the stubborn, improbable nature of love finding root in the hardest of ground. When it was time for the vows, Eli took both of Clara's hands in his. "I have no words to match what you've survived. Clara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "I only have my life. I promise to stand by you. I promise to listen to your silence and to celebrate your voice. I promise to be your home." When it was her turn, Clara's voice was a quiet, steady flame. "I came here with nothing but secrets," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You saw all of me, the darkness and the fear, and you were not afraid. You gave me a place to stop running. I promise to build my life here, with you. I promise to be your peace." When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Eli didn't kiss her with the fierce passion of the train station. He leaned in and touched his lips to hers with a reverence, a tenderness that was a vow in itself. The small group clapped, their applause a warm, welcome sound on the prairie wind. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the land, Eli led her to the porch of the house, their house. The small party had departed, leaving them to the quiet magic of the evening. He drew her close, his arms wrapping around her from behind as they watched the sky blaze with color. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear, his voice a low, intimate whisper meant only for her. "You are no longer a secret," he said, his words a final, binding promise. "You are family." She closed her eyes, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest, and felt the truth of his words settle deep in her soul. The last lock on the last door of her prison had finally, irrevocably, clicked open. They stood there for a long time, watching the fiery spectacle of the sun dipping below the horizon. A cool wind swept across the plains, rustling the dry grass and whispering around the corners of the house. It was the same harsh, lonely wind that had chilled her to the bone on her first day here. It was the same wind that had moaned through the cracks of the old barn, a soundtrack to her nightmares. But now, held safe in her husband's arms, standing on the porch of her own home, the wind felt different. It was just the wind. It sang a song of wide open spaces, of clean air, of a life that stretched out before them, as vast and as full of promise as the darkening sky itself. Here, in the heart of the wild, unforgiving land that had once been the site of her deepest trauma, love had not only survived, it had built a home. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales. And please share your thoughts on Eli and Clara's journey.